Hello students and welcome to Nutrition. My name is Julie Nielsen. I am a registered dietitian, licensed nutritionist, and I will be your instructor for this course. Should be an interesting semester as we move through this online remote learning environment. The setup for this class will include a Zoom session or meeting for our first scheduled class of the week, which for this section will be 9:35 on Tuesdays. The second scheduled class of the week is Thursdays. For this class, there will be an audio lecture posted on our Canvas site. This will give some flexibility to listen to the material according to your own schedule. Hopefully the material will be as interesting to you as it is for me, and it will be beneficial for you going forward, either for personal use or as a healthcare professional. So let's go ahead and get started with Chapter 1, which is an overview of nutrition. The first thing we want to address is what actually is nutrition. Well, most people would say it has something to do with food, which it absolutely does, but it's a science. So by definition, it is the science of the nutrients in food and their actions and functions within the body. As we go through the semester, what you'll see is that individual nutrients are responsible for specific functions. For example, calcium. It's a mineral. It's necessary to build bone. Some B vitamins you'll see are necessary to generate energy within the cells. And we'll get much more specific as we go along. Something else we want to keep in mind is that it doesn't matter what the nutrient is. It is all ingested, and then as it goes through our body, it will be digested, it will be absorbed, transported, metabolized, and then eventually any waste product that's created through this whole process will be excreted. So what actually are nutrients? Well, you could see by definition, they're chemical substances which are contained within the food itself. And our body, through those processes I just mentioned of digestion, transport, absorption, and so on, are able to isolate these nutrients to some extent. And these individual nutrients can then be used to provide energy, provide structural materials to the body, produce regulatory agents, things like hormones, which are necessary for overall growth, maintenance, and repair. There are also certain nutrients that you'll see have been identified that may actually help reduce the risk of some diseases. Some of the chronic diseases which are prevalent, especially in our country, certain nutrients may actually help to prevent the onset of them. Another term to be familiar with is nutritional status. State of the body as a result of the body's intake and use of nutrients. To put it in a more simple way, we can just say you are what you eat, if anybody's ever heard that term. Basically, that just refers to, you can assume your body is going to be in a better condition if you make healthy food choices. If you make poor food choices, the effects may be on your overall health itself. So nutrition ideally is designed for two roles. It is to promote health as well as prevent disease. Once again, making healthy food choices can lead us in that proper direction. Before we jump into the scientific aspects of nutrition, let's first take a look at what influences our eating habits. What makes us select the foods that we do? First one that we want to take a look at includes our personal preferences or our habits. Usually what we tend to do is eat foods that we like, or often we go back over and over to the same food as a habit tends to develop. Ethnic heritage and regional cuisine also come into play, and this is actually considered to be among the strongest influences on food choices. People tend to prefer foods that they grew up eating. Also, depending on where you live, there may be an abundance of a certain food which you have more access to, and certainly that's going to come into play as to why you select it. Social interactions, another influence. Meals are often considered to be social events, and what tends to be available at these gatherings certainly is going to affect what we choose to eat. Marketing definitely comes into play. It's a major influence on food choices. The food industries compete for our food dollars on a daily basis, trying to persuade us to eat more, especially of their foods. Availability, convenience, economy often come into play. People will eat foods that they have on hand, that are available. Those that are quick, convenient, easy to fix. Also, economy comes into play. We tend to select foods that are within our financial means. Then there's also some psychological effects. Emotions can come into play. Also what we refer to as positive and negative associations. Some people are emotional eaters. If they're stressed, if they're anxious, they may tend to eat more food or eat certain foods. On the other hand, there may be people who are anxious or stressed who really can't eat anything at all. So those emotions can really have a strong impact. Then as far as positive associations, what can happen is we choose foods that remind us of some happy event. Often we can refer to them as comfort foods. Often things like ice cream, birthday cake, that takes us back to a time maybe when we were a child at a birthday party, and it causes us to feel happy. So when we see those foods, they go ahead and make us happy and we choose to consume them. Then there are foods that have negative associations. These may be maybe a food that made you sick at some point. If you see the food again, you tend to stay away from it because it has a negative connotation. Maybe there is a food that you were forced to eat as a child. That also might be a food that you just cannot bring yourself to eat because once again, it has a negative association. Then people's values can also come into play. Food choices may reflect one's religious beliefs, political views, environmental concerns, and so on. As far as religious effects, there may be certain religions which must avoid certain foods. So obviously that's going to come into play. Environmental concerns can be an effect on some people. You might have somebody who will only choose to buy foods that are grown locally to cut down on the environmental effects of transportation, global warming, and such that result in having to ship foods long distances. Even another example might be someone who becomes a vegetarian because they are supporting animal rights. So there's a lot of values that can also come into play. Medical conditions also can play an effect. People who are diagnosed with, say, diabetes, they certainly need to monitor their carbohydrate intake. Those who are diagnosed with cardiovascular disease should be monitoring not only their saturated fat intake, but as well as their sodium. So those are all going to affect the foods that are being selected. Lastly, you'll note on this list, number 9, nutritive value. And even though I have it listed last here, it really should be considered to be the most important influence on our eating habits. We should really be selecting foods because we know they are nutrient rich and have health benefits. Those health benefits then in turn can keep us on track for health promotion and disease prevention. So now let's jump into the actual nutrients themselves. There are 6 classes of nutrients, and they contain carbohydrate, protein, fat, vitamins, minerals, and water. There's a definition you want to be familiar with, and that is the term essential nutrients. This refers to those nutrients which the body cannot make or cannot make in sufficient amounts. So if your body can't make these nutrients, where do you have to get them from? Well, obviously the answer is going to be from our food choices. Other definitions you want to be aware of are the terms organic and inorganic. And I'm sure from other classes, maybe chemistry, you recall what makes something organic is whether it contains carbon or not. An organic nutrient contains carbon, while an inorganic nutrient does not contain carbon. So the first group we're going to look at are those nutrients which we refer to as energy yielding. And these include carbohydrate, protein, as well as fat. Now when we go through the chapters 4, 5, and 6, which cover these nutrients in more depth, what you're going to see from their chemical composition is that they contain carbon. So therefore, they are organic nutrients. What you're also going to see is that these nutrients provide us with a certain amount of calories when we consume them. So carbohydrate contains 4 calories per gram, or I should really say provides 4 calories per gram. Protein also provides us with 4 calories per gram, and fat provides us with a larger amount, actually 9 calories per gram. Now when we hear that term calorie, we're really referring to what's known as a kilocalorie. It is not a part of the food. It's not a constituent of the food, but it's a measure of the energy that's released when we actually eat the food. Again, going back probably through your chemistry course, you'll recall that a calorie, or more specifically a kilocalorie, is the amount of heat necessary to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water 1 degree Celsius. What happens when we consume a food is that as it travels through our GI tract and goes through the digestion process, absorption, metabolism, and so on, the bonds between these long chains of carbohydrate, fat, and protein, they're broken apart. As they're broken apart, energy is now released, which is able to fuel the activities of our body. Foods generally are a mixture of the 3 energy-yielding nutrients. Often we think of, say, a serving of a meat. It is considered to be a protein, and it does contain protein. But if we look at it closely, what we'll see is that chemically, it's also made up of fat, water, vitamins, minerals. Same thing can apply with, say, maybe a slice of bread. We usually consider that to be a carbohydrate, and it does have a large amount of carbohydrate, but once again, if we look closely at its chemical makeup, we're also going to see a little bit of protein in there. We're going to see some vitamins, we'll see some minerals, even see a little bit of water. Something else that we're going to observe as we go through the semester is that if we consume any of these energy-yielding nutrients in excess, our body has the capability of storing them all as fat. Often people might think if they're consuming a very high protein diet that all of that protein is going to be incorporated into muscle. Not necessarily true. If they're taking in more protein than what their body needs to use as a source of fuel or to build muscle or to use for other necessary functions, we're going to actually take that protein and turn it into fat, and it will therefore be stored as additional body fat. Knowing that carbohydrate, fat, and protein now provide us with a certain amount of calories per gram, how can we calculate how many total calories are being provided by a particular food? Well, we're going to look right into our text. This is from page 10 in the textbook if you have the hard copy. If you have the ebook, it might be on a different page, but you're going to look for the title, How To, and the number there is 1-2. Calculate the energy available from foods. This particular example is using a slice of bread with a tablespoon of peanut butter on it. This particular combination gives you 16 grams of carbs, 7 grams of protein, 9 grams of fat. Very simply, all you need to do is multiply each one of those energy-yielding nutrients by how many calories per gram they are providing. So 16 grams of carbs times 4 calories per gram equals 64 calories. 7 grams of protein multiplied by 4 calories per gram, 28 calories. 9 grams of fat is going to provide you with 9 calories per gram. Simple multiplication again is 81 calories. Just total those up. This particular food is going to provide you with 173 calories. Often, you might be looking at a food label and you see the amount of calories that it's providing, but you might have not had any idea where that calculation comes from. Well, now you can actually do some calculations on your own. You can take this one step further if you are interested in how many calories percentage-wise are being provided by these energy-yielding nutrients. Often people who are keeping track of their macros or macronutrients, which include carbohydrate, fat, and protein, are interested in these percentages. So to figure out these percentages, you could see our example here. If you want to know the percentage of calories coming from fat in a particular food, it's going to be a simple division. So in this case, those 81 calories coming from fat, you divide by the total amount of calories. So this particular food is giving you 47% of its calories coming from fat. Now, some people might consider that to be a little bit high, and they might decide to try a different type of a food. So if you want to figure out your percentages, that's how you would calculate those. I would suggest, just to get a little bit more practice with this concept, if you are also looking again at this particular example, at the bottom you could see you can practice a little bit more. Calculate the amount of energy, or specifically calories, that are provided from, as an example, a bean burrito with cheese. This food is going to give you 55 grams of carbohydrate, 15 grams of protein, 12 grams of fat. How are you going to take that information to determine the total amount of calories being provided? The next category of nutrients that we have are the vitamins, and these, similar to the energy-yielding nutrients, are also organic, meaning that they contain carbon. There have been 13 individual vitamins which have been identified, and each one of them has very specific roles in the body itself. You're going to see as we go through chapter 10 what these specific roles are. Vitamins are a little bit different compared to the energy-yielding nutrients, basically in the amount of them that we consume. We tend to consume them in very small quantities, usually milligrams or even micrograms. That compared to the energy-yielding nutrients, we consume them in large amounts or in gram amounts. Vitamins are also very vulnerable to changes in the environment. Again, as we go through chapter 10, you'll see that there are some which break down if they're exposed to heat. There's some that will break down if they're exposed to light. Again, compared to the energy-yielding nutrients, they tend to be much more stable. We'll also take a look at the classification of nutrients, which are the minerals. Minerals are inorganic, which means that they do not contain any carbon. There are 16 which have been identified, which are essential for human nutrition. Minerals are a little bit different compared to the vitamins in that we consume them in varying amounts. Depending on the particular mineral, we might consume very small amounts of it, maybe milligrams. An example would be iron, which we consume in small amounts. Then there are some minerals that we consume in much larger amounts. Think about sodium. We consume a lot of sodium, especially in the American diet, and we can consume it in more so gram amounts. So there's a huge variance in consumption across all of the minerals itself. Many of the minerals tend to be structural components within the body. As an example, think of calcium. Calcium, most of us are aware, is necessary to build bone and teeth, which are structural components in the body itself. Minerals are also different as far as their ability to break down. As I mentioned with the vitamins, they can start to decompose when their environment is changed, if they're exposed to temperature changes, light changes, and so forth. Minerals, for the most part, tend to be very, very stable. They remain in the body until they are excreted. Water is the last category that we'll take a look at, and water also is inorganic, again, not containing any carbon. Out of all of these nutrients that I've touched on, what's important to note is that water is considered to be the most indispensable. It's considered to be the most important of all of these nutrients. We could probably live a couple weeks without food. Obviously, that can't happen without water. It's estimated that a human can live maybe up to about 3 days without water. We also consume a large amount of water compared to all of the other nutrients. Water tends to be a component of most of the foods that we're consuming. So the beverages that we drink along with foods contribute a great amount of water. Water also participates in so many different chemical reactions within the body, and we'll take a look at some of these. And it's often generated as a byproduct during energy metabolism. So while your body is breaking down carbohydrate, fat, and protein, usually water is being produced somewhere along the metabolic pathway. So that was a really quick overview of the 6 classes of nutrients, and we'll go through each one of those in more detail as we go through the semester. Something else that's interesting to note, however, is that the nutrient composition of our body is very similar to the materials that are found in foods. The human body is made up of, on average, about 60% water. Then fat can range, depending on gender mostly, from about 18% up to about 26, maybe 28%. The remaining percentages are going to be found from carbohydrate, protein, vitamins, and minerals. Now that we've identified the classes of nutrients and we know that food, or specifically nutrition, is important to promote health and prevent disease, we want to start thinking about making appropriate food choices. Making these healthy choices ideally will keep us in a good nutritional status. We can also consider this process as a way to avoid malnutrition. So what is malnutrition? Well, by definition, it's any condition caused by an excess or a deficiency of food energy referring to calories, or nutrient intake, or by an imbalance of a certain nutrient or nutrients. Under the category of malnutrition, we also have what's known as undernutrition, which would be inadequate amounts of nutrients or inadequate amount of calories. With the deficiency of calories, someone might display symptoms which can include weight loss, losing muscle mass, becoming more prone to infection, or even various diseases. If someone is deficient in a specific nutrient, first of all, it depends on what the nutrient is, but they can experience things like muscle spasms, skin rashes, hair loss, so on and so forth. Another definition is that overnutrition. What does that mean? It means taking in excess amounts of calories or energy, or also individual nutrients. What can happen if someone takes in too many calories? They're going to experience overnutrition in the way that they can become overweight or obese. That in turn can make them more vulnerable to diseases that are associated with overnutrition, such as heart disease or diabetes. Then if somebody is experiencing consumption of large amounts of an individual nutrient or nutrients, there are many side effects that can occur, again, depending on the nutrient. Something like yellowing of the skin, rapid heart rate, low blood pressure can be the results. So as you can see, ideally, we really want to make sure that we're taking in exactly what we need. To help the general population make sufficient choices so they can avoid or decrease the risk of malnutrition, nutrition experts, which include scientific researchers from the United States and Canada, have produced a set of standards which we refer to as the Dietary Reference Intakes, or the DRIs. So these dietary reference intakes, these DRIs, are determined, and they consist of 4 different sets of values. They include estimated average requirement, recommended dietary allowances, adequate intakes, and tolerable upper intake levels. Usually the first thing that's established is what's known as the estimated average requirement. This is the amount of a nutrient that has been determined that is necessary to maintain a specific function or biochemical processes within the body in about half of a population of healthy people of a given age and of a given gender. Then it's taken one step further as research progresses and the recommended dietary allowances are set. This is the average amount of a nutrient considered adequate to meet the known nutrient needs of a larger population. It's meant to meet the needs of practically all healthy people, or about 98% of all healthy people. This particular figure shows the comparison between the estimated average requirement and the recommended dietary allowances. The estimated average requirement, as you can see, sets its value right at the halfway point. So it's setting a requirement right about the point that it will meet the needs of about 50% of the population. With the RDA, however, the recommended dietary allowance, you'll see that it's set well above the estimated average requirement. It meets about 98% of the healthy population. So with the RDA, there's almost a little bit of an insurance policy built in that if you are consuming a nutrient that is meeting somewhere near the RDA, chances are you are getting adequate amounts. Adequate intakes is another category which falls under the DRIs. And adequate intakes are set when there's insufficient scientific evidence available to determine an estimated average requirement. It's a value that then is also used when an RDA can't be determined for a particular nutrient. It usually is set as the average amount of a nutrient that a group of healthy people consume. So it's based more so on scientific judgment versus scientific evidence. The 4th category, the last category of the DRIs, are the tolerable upper intake levels. And these are pretty important. These are levels that have been determined to be the maximum amount of a nutrient that appears safe for most healthy people. And if someone is to consume above this level, there may actually be some risk of adverse health effects. As we go through the course, you'll see more specifically that there are certain vitamins that if you take in large amounts, if you take in above this tolerable upper intake level, can certainly have some adverse health effects. In addition to the scientific community giving us guidance on individual vitamins and minerals, they also cover the energy-yielding nutrients, carbohydrate, protein, and fat, with establishing the estimated energy requirement, or the EER. You can see by definition it refers to the average dietary energy that will maintain energy balance in a person who has a healthy body weight and a level of physical activity. As we go through the semester, we'll revisit this requirement and also allow you to determine your individual value. The DRI committee also provides guidelines on the energy-yielding nutrients by providing us with what's known as the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. These ranges have been determined to allow for adequate nutrition while reducing the risk of chronic disease. So you could see basic recommendation is that we should be consuming about 45 to 65% of our calories from carbohydrate, 20 to 35% of our calories from fat, and 10 to 35% of our calories from protein. So we're back to where we started. If you recall at the beginning of the lecture, I had stated that the two main goals of nutrition is to promote health and prevent disease. What we're going to find out as we proceed through this semester is that food, or more specifically nutrition, plays a really important role. You can see from this particular table that 4 of the leading causes of death in the United States are directly associated with diet. Heart disease listed as number 1, cancers number 2, strokes number 4, and diabetes number 7. Each one of those has a direct association with poor nutrition. And as we go through the course, you're going to see what some of those connections are. Specifically, as we go into Chapter 18, which deals with the chronic diseases and the relationship to nutrition, you're going to see very, very strong correlations. Another attempt to help the general population promote health and prevent disease is through the Healthy People Program. It was developed by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and focuses on identifying significant but preventable threats to health and what can be done to help eliminate them. At the beginning of each decade, the program sets specific goals, and these goals are meant to improve the nation's health over the next 10 years. These 2 slides list some of the nutrition and weight status objectives which have been developed. Health officials believe that progress for these 2020 goals are mediocre at best. While physical activity, people focusing on muscle building, muscle maintenance has increased, we're still coming up short with goals such as eating more fruits and vegetables, reducing the population of those who are overweight and obese, among others. Hopefully, as we go into the next decade, we'll make some more progress as far as meeting these healthy goals. So take a minute now and just look through the listing of these objectives that do appear on this slide and the next. In addition to the U.S. agencies and organizations providing guidelines for a healthy population, there are more than 40 nations and international organizations that have also published nutrient standards. You might be familiar with some of these, such as the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, the World Health Organization, WHO, among others. These organizations have developed nutrient recommendations with the specific goal of achieving as well as maintaining worldwide health. So what's the wrap-up from Chapter 1? Well, despite much evidence that links certain behaviors with chronic disease, many Americans still continue to engage in them. Unfortunately, American diet patterns and lifestyle have now influenced other cultures and countries. Chronic diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, heart disease have increased dramatically in areas where American foods are now available. Our fast food chains, Taco Bell, McDonald's, so on and so forth, can now be found on almost every continent. It's up to us as part of the global community to make the necessary changes to help ensure a healthy future for all the inhabitants of this earth.